This podcast discusses murder and domestic violence. Listener discretion is advised. Just before noon, on the dreary day of April 2nd, 1901, exactly 4 months and 1 day after the murder of John Hossack, a courtroom door opened in Indianola, Iowa. Into the courtroom walked Margaret Hossack, wife and accused murder of her husband, John. She was dressed all in black. Today would be the first day of her murder trial. All 9 of her children were present in the courtroom, creating a united front for their mother, proclaiming, although perhaps not out loud, that she was innocent by their show of force and solidarity. 6 of her children, Will, Ivan, Jimmy, Cassie, May, and Anna, would testify during the course of the trial and be battered by both sides to tell and retell not only their family's history, but the events of the day and night that their father passed away. It is important to note that at this time in history, women could not vote. Women could not serve on juries. And so, as Margaret Hossack entered the courtroom, she would have seen 12 men sitting in the jury box. She would not be tried by her peers then, but by a jury of her husband's peers. The husband she was accused of brutally bludgeoning to death in their bed after 32 years of marriage. Just to make these court proceedings easier to remember, I will not be presenting the evidence in a linear fashion. All of the prosecution's statements will not come first and all of the defense's second. Instead, I'm going to list every point presented by the prosecution and immediately go into the counterattack of the defense, so as to hopefully help in seeing how the trial played out point for point. To list everything that the defense said than everything the prosecution said seems like a lot to remember to me. So going point by point will hopefully help you. It definitely helped me when I was sorting everything together. Also helpful to note will be the main people who presented all the statements and evidences in this courtroom, abuzz with speculation and whispers of spectators with their own theories of who was responsible for John Hossack's death and what the outcome of the trial would be. Helming the prosecution was George Clammer, and Margaret Hossack's defense team was led by William Barry, with John Henderson also assisting. The presiding judge was Judge James Gamble. This will not be a word-for-word blow or transcript of the court as well. This will be simply the evidence presented for both sides. And although all the evidence was actually presented in court, like I said, these words will not be exact words. Other important things of note that will hopefully be helpful in making more sense of the trial are as follows. The bloody undergarment that Margaret Hossack had been wearing was not admissible as evidence in court. A few days after the murder, Deputy Kimmer returned to the Hossack farm to find the undergarment. He did, however, the clothing had been submerged in water and was deemed unusable for the court. The undergarment, if you remember, had splashes of blood along the back side of the garment, but only 1 or 2 spots on the front, according to some people, and according to others, it was completely clean without any spots on the front at all. And although these testimonies are important in the trial, I'm going to summarize the testimonies of Margaret's children here. In the previous episodes, we already discussed the events as they were retold by the family, so I just thought it would be easier to kind of summarize here what the children testified. Will testified first, talking about the axe and how he had slaughtered a turkey with it 2 days before the murder. There could have been foul blood and feathers still left on the axe by the time of his father's murder. Ivan testified about putting the axe away, though he could not say with certainty whether he had left it in the granary or underneath or next to the granary. Jimmy's questioning was the most interesting. At a grand jury hearing before his mother's trial, he had said that he had heard his parents arguing the night his father was murdered. However, at the trial of his mother, he recanted this statement, saying that he had never heard his parents arguing that night. No matter how much George Clamor of the prosecution pressed, Jimmy would not change his story. He had not heard his parents argue the night of his father's death. Cassie, May, and Anna also all testified about the state of their parents' relationship, saying that there had been many problems in the family. But after the Thanksgiving of 1899, the household had mended itself and they were now happy. So with all of these facts in mind, we will begin the trial of Margaret Hossack with the prosecution's opening statement. Hate. Hate is what fueled Margaret Hossack to murder her husband as he slept. Or so proclaimed George Clamor, head of the team prosecuting Margaret Hossack for the murder of John Hossack. There was perhaps another fight that night that John was killed, another fight that pushed Margaret Hossack over the edge. For 32 long and painful years, she had stood by the side of a man who belittled her, who ranted against her, who could become unstable and uncouth at the slightest of provocations. For 32 years, she had held her tongue and her peace, had continued to cater to his needs, to feed and clothe him. But tonight, the night of December 1st, 1900, that patience was finally broken. Once her husband was asleep, Margaret crept outside and picked up the family's axe. Returning to her bed, she looked down once more at her sleeping husband before raising the axe and hitting him across the head with the sharpened end. And then, still in a silent rage, raised the axe again and brought the dull end down against his skull, shattering pieces of the bone and driving them deep within his brain. She then calmly carried the axe across her home, putting either her hand or a rag beneath the head of the axe so that little or no blood would drop onto the floor. Before putting the axe back where she had found it, Margaret Hossack cleaned what she thought was all traces of her husband from the weapon. However, upon returning to her room, Margaret detected that her husband was not dead. He was still breathing. Worried, Margaret Hossack thought of a plan and regained her calm exposure. Waiting a few minutes to gather her thoughts, Margaret then ran to the stairs and called to her children, making up the false story of a sound heard in the night and being worried about her husband still in bed. How, George Clamor asked, would it be possible for a woman such as her to be lying in bed next to her husband and not also be hit by the axe as it came down on him? How would it be possible for a man to be bludgeoned in his bed, not a foot away from his wife, and have the wife sleep through it all? How? How? And why? Why, for the love of God, did Margaret Hossack, upon being awoken by a loud noise, not call out for her husband? Why did she not reach over and shake him, try to awake him, for him to investigate what the noise could have been? Why? Why? Because fueled by 32 years of hate, Margaret Hossack had not slept through her husband's murder. Rather, she had been the one lifting the axe and brutally killing him whilst he slept. When George Clamor finished his opening statements, many in the courtroom were both mesmerized and horrified by his retelling of the crime as it could have happened. As they sat stunned in their places, William Barry, Margaret's defense attorney, rose and gave his opening remarks. Margaret Hossack was not a murderer, but she was a devoted wife and mother. For 32 years, Margaret Hossack had taken care of her husband and their children. She had cooked for him, cleaned the house, mended his clothing. She had helped in the running of the farm, collecting eggs, churning butter, planting and harvesting what grew in their garden. Margaret Hossack had stood side by side to help John achieve all that he ever wanted, a prosperous farm and a family. Yes, she had quarreled with her husband, but what marriage was without the occasional fight? Yes, she and John may have fought more than others, But they had reconciled. Of that, there was no doubt. Her children, her neighbors, her friends, all testified that for the year before his death, John and Margaret Hossack had been conflict-free, living in a sense of peace and stability for perhaps the first time in their marriage. They were a happy family when John died, not a family full of anger and malice. Upon seeing that her husband was injured, Margaret Hossack stayed by his side and nursed him, wiping blood from his face and holding his hand until he died. And most importantly, she had not killed her husband. She was awoken by a sound in the night, and only then did she discover her injured husband. Margaret Hossack was innocent of the crime she was accused of committing. With both sides having presented their opening statements, the trial proceeded into the evidence phase, beginning with the prosecution, and George Clammer once again bringing to the jury's mind the instability of the Hossack marriage. There was often friction between the couple. More than once, Margaret had been heard to say that she would not mind if her husband died, that life would be better without him. Friends and neighbors testified under oath to this, that John was a man quick to anger, and Margaret was a woman left alone, left to her farm where she worked hard and lived, always under the hand of her husband, whom she despised. In response to these claims, Barry questioned the same witnesses and reminded the court that the Hossacks had lived in peace for a year. He asked the witnesses to describe the differences between the Thanksgivings of the last 2 years. The first one where Margaret had stormed upstairs at her husband's insistence, then secretly left the house, and the Thanksgiving that had taken place 2 days before the murder. All witnesses said that there was a marked improvement in the relationship. No longer did the Hossacks quarrel. In fact, on the Thanksgiving before his death, the whole family had been happy and content. There was then no reason for Margaret to have killed her husband, for both had repented of their ways and were now devoted to not only their children, but to each other as well. The prosecution's next point of argument was John Hossack's speech and the blood clot that had formed on his head. Margaret Hossack's children, who were present in the house at the time of the murder, claimed that John Hossack was speaking right after the attack. When Dr. Dean, the doctor who attended to John Hossack until his death, was questioned, he said that although there was no fast and hard rule, speech was more likely to come from John Hossack right after the attack. As his brain leaked out from the wound and he lost blood, his ability to speak would have become more impaired. This did not seem to suit the prosecution's case, but George Clammer had 2 other doctors to question, Doctors Porterfield and Serber, who had both participated in the inquest jury after assisting in the autopsy of John Hossack. Dr. Harry Dale, the coroner, had earlier stated in an article only 6 days after the crime that the testimony of Margaret's own children pointed to her guilt. The children said that John was speaking in what, according to them, would have been mere moments after the attack, perhaps 1 or 2 minutes. Yet, due to the sudden shock and trauma of such a brain injury, Dr. Dale had stated in this article that any sort of speech would be impossible until 8 to 10 minutes after the attack. Dr. Dale had further stated in this article that blood would not have coagulated right away, and it would have taken 5 to 10 minutes for a teacup-sized blood clot to form on the right side of John Hossack's head. Margaret must have tried to kill her husband, and after taking care of the axe, had returned to see her husband still alive. Only then did she call to her children. The lapse in time between the blows and his discovery would therefore line up with the state that John Hossack was in when his children first saw him. Clamor was well aware of this article and the words stated therein, and so before questioning the two doctors, Clamor reminded everyone in the courtroom of the state John Hossack was in when his children found him. He had 2 traumatic wounds to his head. The right eye was discolored and swollen. There was a massive blood clot forming, and the man was speaking. Clamor then turned to Dr. Porterfield. "How long, doctor, would it take for a man suffering from such blows to come into such a state as he was when his family found him?" 30 minutes to an hour, Dr. Porterfield responded. When Dr. Serber was called to the stand, he backed up Dr. Porterfield's claims, saying that he would have guessed the discoloration around the eye would have taken about 20 minutes, and that John would not have been able to speak for at least 30 minutes. Clamor rested his point and let that evidence sink into the jury before John Henderson of the defense team then stood to cross-examine Dr. Porterfield. He began first with a barrage of questions. Had Dr. Porterfield ever treated a patient who had the same injury as John Hossack? No. Then his inference must be based only on reading. Yes. Could he really be conclusive then? No. So you are only guessing? Yes. So you really don't know when he could have recovered consciousness. You cannot make a definitive statement of the exact time. I cannot, Dr. Porterfield conceded. Henderson ended with the story of a man who had had a pole blown straight through his brain and managed to survive, speaking right after the accident. He did not even lose consciousness. Though not stated in the court documents, there is no doubt that the case Henderson is referring to is that of Phineas Gage, who had an iron bar blasted through his brain, coming in through his cheek and out the top of his skull. He lived for 12 years after this accident. Henderson asked Dr. Porterfield then, considering the facts that this man, Phineas Gage, could speak, couldn't John Hossack as well? That man was an exceptional case, Dr. Porterfield fought back. Couldn't John Hossack also have been an exceptional case, remaining conscious even after he had received a traumatic brain injury? Dr. Porterfield had to admit that it was possible. With the speech and blood clots seemingly going nowhere, Clamor began his next attack, bringing up the evidence of the hair and blood found on the Hossack's axe that could have been the murder weapon. Remember that the axe had been found the very morning of the murder and was expected to be the murder weapon. It is not noted that anyone else searched for another weapon that could have been used by the perpetrator to bludgeon John Hossack to death. 3 hairs and some blood were found on the axe. Sheriff Hodson had taken those 3 hairs and put them in his pocketbook for safekeeping. When Clamor had realized that he needed John Hossack's hair to compare with the hairs that were found on the axe, he had Sheriff Hodson and George Moore, the undertaker, dig up John's coffin. This would have been around mid-December of 1900, a few weeks after the murder. Imagine the scene of looking down onto the murdered face of someone you knew, of seeing him again only a few weeks after his death. Had the cold preserved his body well? Could you still see the marks that wrought the fatal blow upon him? These facts are not recorded, but what was recorded is that George Moore, after digging up John Hossack, clipped some hairs from his head as close to the wound as he could get. These hairs, along with the hairs from the sheriff's pocketbook, from the axe, were brought to Professor John Tilton at Simpson College. He was asked to examine the hair samples and see if they matched. It is important to note that Simpson was a geologist, not any sort of expert that would have known definitively about hair, though he could examine them closely and see what he could find. Professor John Tilton was present that day in the courtroom and testified that he had examined both the blood on the axe as well as the hairs. The blood, he said, was from a bird, which would be consistent with Will's story of slaughtering a turkey with the very same axe 2 days before the murder. But Tilton also stated that other blood could have been present on the axe, though he was not positively sure in that statement. When it came to the hairs, he said the first two were like a dog, or perhaps a human's, but the third was strange and different from the other two. But if they had all come from the same place, they must all be human hair. Whether or not the hairs were John Hossack's at all, he could not say, only stating that all the hairs could have come from the same head. Not the best argument for the prosecution, and the defense knew it. When Barry came to the stand, he began to talk about the hairs, beginning with the questioning of Sheriff Hodson, who had collected the hairs. How long had Sheriff Hodson had the hairs in his pocket? 6 to 10 days, Sheriff Hodson replied. And then he gave them to Clamor and never saw them again. That was correct. How then did he know that the hairs that he gave to Clamor were the same that Clamor gave to Tilton? Sheriff Hodson didn't know, and couldn't know. A chain of custody could therefore not be determined. Is that correct? That is correct. When he asked Tilton again if the hairs came from the same person, Tilton said that he couldn't be sure. They resembled each other, but it was only a guess. Before resting his case, George Clamor of the prosecuting team again attacked Margaret Hossack personally, railing against her and her hatred of her husband. Many of her neighbors and friends were called to the stand and all testified that she was afraid of John, some of them even stating that she told them more than once that she wanted her husband dead. With these statements, the prosecution rested its case. In response, the defense reminded the jury and all those present that John was a cantankerous old man, known for his temper. Perhaps a row with a neighbor led to his death. What evidence was there of this? The dog, Barry stated. More than one of the Hossack children had said that on that night their family dog Shep was acting strangely. He would not come when called, would not respond to any commands, and when Johnny tried to pick him up, the dog simply collapsed down again and would not follow his master. If Margaret Hossack was guilty, why drug the dog? If someone else was guilty, though, drugging the dog would have made sense, as Shep would have alerted the family to any approaching danger. Now, before he ended his defense, Barry called Margaret Hossack to the stand. She moved slowly and spoke quietly, but firmly. She testified that she made supper that night, milked the cows, mended clothing, and churned butter. She heard the dog barking earlier in the day, as if something was bothering him, but when she went to find him, nothing was there. She went to bed after her husband and was awoken in the night by a noise. She got up and searched for the source of the sound before returning to her room, having called for her husband multiple times, but receiving no answer, and seeing that he was still in bed, she became worried and called for her children, who came down the stairs. Barry then pounded her with a series of to-the-point questions. Did you strike your husband? No. Did anyone to your knowledge strike him? No. All you heard was that noise that awoke you? Yes. Did you see anyone else in the house that night besides your husband and children? No. Was anyone in the house that night that you know of? No. Did you take this axe? Barry held up the axe. In your hand that night? No. Did you have any sharp instruments in your hands that night after you went to bed? No. Any blunt ones? No. Did you strike John Hossack with anything? No. Do you know who it is that struck him? No. Barry ended his questioning of Margaret Hossack. When the prosecution rose to question her, her story remained the same, only that the time she churned the butter was slightly different, but that was well before she and her husband went to bed. Not being able to dissuade her to change her story, the prosecution ended its questioning of Margaret Hossack. By this time, it was the night of April 7th, and the morning of April 8th began with the prosecution's closing arguments. George Clammer arose and gave a detailed retelling of what he thought happened the night John Hossack died. Margaret had hated John for years, despised him. They had argued that night as they often did, and she had had enough. When her husband was vulnerable, asleep in their bed, Margaret Hossack decided to end her troubles. She crept from the house out to the granary, where she opened the door and took the axe from inside. Moving quietly, but with purpose, she re-entered her own house, a house she had helped to build and maintain for 32 years. She walked to her bedroom and stood over the bed, seeing her husband breathing there, peacefully. Nothing disturbed his sleep. Nothing ever disturbed him at all. Not the years of abuse, not the fights, nothing. Nothing at all. And nothing ever would again. With 2 swift blows, Margaret brought first the sharp end of the axe against her husband's head, and then lifting it again, turned it to crush his skull with the blunt end. She must have reveled in what she had done, been cold, calculating, and planning, for she then tried to not even get a drop of blood on the floor, cradling the axe in her hand and walking from the house. She washed the axe in a barrel of rainwater, but coming to the granary, could not remember. Had she taken the axe from inside, or had it been laying under the granary? Not sure, Margaret tucked the axe underneath the granary and returned to her house. No doubt, she was getting ready for the performance of a lifetime, ready to scream and holler and break down at the sight of her dead husband. But what? What is this? John Hossack still breathes. Margaret must have frozen then, wondered what to do. She had not killed her husband. Not yet, anyway. Then what? What to do? How long she stood in the doorway of their bedroom is unknown, but Margaret Hossack came to the conclusion that she must feign her innocence. She heard something in the night, a loud cracking sound that awoke her. She went to the front door, found it open. Someone must have come in, and her husband, her dear, poor husband, was at death's door. Only when her story was formed did Margaret hurry to the stairs and call for her children, ready for them to be witness to the death of their father, to be witness to her version of events as they played out. But what? What? Clammer cried to the jury, could have made Margaret Hossack hate her husband enough to kill him? What would drive a woman to murder? He turned to Margaret Hossack, who must have paled at all the thoughts running through her head. What did Clammer know that all the others did not? Clammer knew and revealed that Margaret Hossack's first son, Alex, was conceived before her marriage to John. An audible gasp went up from the spectators. Her son was conceived before her marriage, and she was therefore compelled to marry John Hossack, a man she despised, a man who had sullied her, taken her future from her, had taken her away from her land, her friends, her own family. A man who for 32 years she had served, and for what? For abuse? To be yelled at? To have her children threatened and frightened by the same man who had impregnated her before marriage? Everyone listened as the secret Margaret and John had kept for 32 years was revealed. George Clammer's final words to the court that day were, "She did it, gentlemen, and I ask you to return it to her in kind, that having considered all this case as honest, honorable men, knowing as you do your enormous responsibility, that you will return to her a debt at the hands of the law. She has forfeited her right to live. She should be where John Hossack lies, rotting beneath the ground." Whereas the prosecution depicted Margaret in its closing statements as a spiteful, malevolent wife full of years of hatred, the defense painted her as the dutiful wife who had for years taken care of her children and husband, holding his hand until the shadow of death overtook him. William Barry also reminded the jury that the experts for the prosecution had all been shown to be unsure of their facts and that therefore none of their evidence was conclusive. Although the bloodied undergarment was not physically present at the trial, he recounted the witness statements. There was blood on the back of the undergarment, not the front. How could that be possible, he asked the jury, unless she did not kill him? If she had raised the axe, not once, but twice, as Clammer said, the front of her undergarment would be dripping with her husband's blood. Barry's final words to the jury were, "I am now leaving you the fate of a woman who before high heaven I believe to be innocent." Both sides had presented their arguments, witnesses, and evidence. And a week after the trial had begun, the jury left to make their decision. They did not reach their decision until 10 o'clock the next morning. Margaret Hossack was brought back to the courtroom, where the jury handed their written decision to the judge, who himself read the verdict before handing it to his clerk to be read aloud to those present. We, the jury, find Margaret Hossack guilty of murder in the first degree. This podcast was written and produced by me, Tate Rudolphi. If you are interested in any of my source materials, please see the podcast description. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share. You can follow this and future podcasts produced by me on my Instagram at Tate Presents. Thank you for listening.